Hello Unreal Engine games developers and designers. Today we're going to continue our multiplayer scoring by creating a scoreboard so that each player can see every other player's score on the screen. So let's get straight to it. Welcome back everybody to this desert driving game series. And if this is the first video of mine you've come across, then please go to the playlists in the description and you can catch up on all the previous tutorials. Today we're going to do multiplayer scoring part 2. If you remember, in last week's episode we put in a scoring system to show the score for each player on their respective screens. So if I go into play mode, you can see I had the score at the bottom for the player, and if I go through a gate, it updated the score for that player on the server and then showed the current score on the screen. And what we're going to do today is we're going to build on that and show a multiplayer scoreboard so that every player can see every other player's score when there's a change in the score. Luckily we've done a lot of the groundwork last week. Most of today is going to be doing the widgets and then just adding in calling the event to update the scoreboard at the right time. So let's get straight into that. Come out of play mode, go to your content, and we created a UI folder where we stored the My Score widget before. We need to first of all create a scoreboard container widget. So go into user interface widget blueprint and we'll call this a W scoreboard. And let's open it up. And really we want just a container in here for each of the players' scores. So it's going to be a very slimmed down widget that we create here. So we need to create a vertical box in the canvas panel so that each player will be on a different row of this vertical box. And let's go to that vertical box and we'll anchor it in the top left. Put it in slightly from the corner, so let's say 50 pixels in on the X and Y, and then just zero out everything else for now. And that's pretty much it. Let's just give it a name, this box, because we'll need to access this as a variable later to add our children. So let's call it W player container, and it's a variable. Compile, save, and we'll come back and do some more logic in here, but that's pretty much all we want to do here for now. Leave it open, go back to your project, and now we're going to create the scoreboard player row widget. So again, right click, user interface, new widget blueprint, and we'll call this one W scoreboard player, and open that up. So in this we're going to create a holder for the player name and the player score. So what we want to do here is create, we don't need a canvas panel, let's create a horizontal box to hold our two fields. And then we want these to be a fixed size, these two elements, otherwise the scores and the player names won't line up. So within this horizontal box, create two size boxes. Drag them into the horizontal box. The first one will make if you go to the width override, we'll make that 300. And the other size box for the score will change the width override to 50. And again, we now need to put in the text fields for the size boxes. So go to the palette and we want a text field in the first size box and another text field in the second size box. So our first one is going to be the player name. So let's call it W player name. And just for now, we'll just put in text, just some holder text that says player name. go to the other text block. Let's call this one W score. And just put in 0 as a placeholder for now. And let's just do some sort of padding and justification here. So on the player name, let's put some padding of 10 around it and align it to the right so it's close to the score and in the center of the box. When this actually gets put out, it'll obviously it won't be this tall. It'll only be as tall as it needs to be in the actual container, so it'll be pretty shallow. On the score, same padding of 10. We'll justify this to the left and the center. Okay, and that's pretty much it. There's one last thing I want to do here. Well, actually two things. What happens if you have a really long player name? Let's go to the player name widget. And let's just say if you've got this, what happens is it overlaps into the score. And there's a few ways you can deal with this. You can go down to the wrap text and you can do that, but that won't work very well if you've just got one long name with no spaces. So that's probably not the way we want to do it. There's another good way of handling this though, which is to use something called a scale box. So if you position yourself on your player name, right click and say wrap with scale box, you can see that it's made sure that that long name fits in to that, and it will scale automatically. So if we go to our player name and we change the older text back to player name, oops, let me hit the right button, I've deleted, and that's Control Z. If we get rid of that, you'll see that it goes back up to the normal size. So it'll only make it smaller if it's a very long value. I said there was one other thing I wanted to do. I want to just put a slight color in this scoreboard. So if I go to the horizontal box and wrap it with a border, everything will go white at the moment, that's okay. Click on the border and change the brush color. And I change it to a sort of a blue. Let's make it a bit darker. And let's make the opacity, the alpha value 0.5, so you can see through a bit to the desert behind. And I think we're done. So we've created the player holder for the scoreboard. What we now need to do is we now need to create a variable for the player name and the score that we can, when we spawn this widget, we can pass in the right name and score at that time. So let's go to the graph and create two new variables. So the first one I'm going to call player name, and this is going to be a string, and we need to make sure that we expose on spawn, so instance editable and expose on spawn. This means that when we create this widget, we'll be able to pass that player name in from the blueprint logic. Go on to the next variable, call this score. This is going to be an integer and instance editable and expose on spawn as well. So we've got a string for the player name and an integer for the score. Last thing we need to do here is we need to bind these two variables to the widgets we created so that when they're updated they automatically appear in the form. So take our player name and bind it to player name, and take our score widget and bind that to score, and that should do the trick. We can actually do a quick test of this to see what it looks like. Let's compile and save that, go back to the scoreboard, and we can drag in these scoreboard player widgets just to see what they look like. So go to the user created section I'm back in the scoreboard widget now, and you've got there the scoreboard player widget. Just drag it into your player container place. Drag 3 of these in. So it looks right in terms of layout. For some reason it's not doing the background color. Okay, I've seen what might be the problem. In the player container, make sure you click size to content, and that will make sure that the border fills the whole content as well with the background. So we've now got our container which can accept a dynamic number of players in there, which will now create the logic to create. So let's get rid of those scoreboard players that we put in there temporarily. So we've still got our player container. And now what we need to do is we need to put in an event that updates a score in this player container when a score is replicated. So remember from last week, we used the rep notify to tell the player controller client when a score had been updated, and then we called the player score widget. What we now want to do is we want to call this widget as well, and then go through all the player scores and put them all out in this player container. So go to your graph in the scoreboard widget. Let's get rid of the events that are there, and we're going to create a new event, so custom event, which I will call update score. And the first thing I want to do is, or the main thing I want to do is go through all of the player scores, creating a widget for each player. So you may ask yourself, how do you get an array of all of the players who are in the game? Let me just go over to show you a slide that I showed you last week from this network compendium document. You remember we've been using the player states to update and store the score, and we update it on the server, we wait until it gets replicated to the player, and then we call the update score event. Now you've also got this useful game state object which similarly is replicated, and this game state actually keeps track of all the players and player states that are in the game. So if we start from this game state, we should be able to do a for each loop through each of the player states and then create a scoreboard player widget for each one. So let's do that. Let's go back to the update score event, and we'll start off by getting the game state. And then if you drag off the game state and type player, you've got get player array. And if you hover over player array, you see it says it's an array of player state object references, which is exactly what we want. So it's got each player state in the game. And now we drag off this and do a for each loop. And that's going to go through each player in turn. So this array element is a player state. We need to cast it to our custom player state where we stored our values. So drag out of here, cast to BP my player state, and attach that to the loop body. And then from here we can get the player score and the player name. So let's do that. Let's drag out of here and do get player name. You may be asking yourself, well, we hadn't set up a player name. Well, at some point in a future tutorial, we'll put in a front-end matchmaking and lobby system. So the player state does store the player name by default. In our editor environment, it'll just be a user created, a system created player name, but it'll suffice for now to show how it'll work. And then we'll also drag off the player state and get the player score. So we've now got our two variables from the player state. What we now need to do is create a widget for the scoreboard. So let's do create widget. And the widget we want to create is the scoreboard player. And you see, because we made those two variables editable and expose on spawn, we can now pass in the player name that we've got from the custom player state and the score. And the final thing we want to do is we want to add this to our scoreboard player container. So remember we just created a container in this scoreboard. So use Control to drag this out. And if you drag off here and do add child to vertical box, and then drag in the executable pin and the value of the player widget. So what that will do is it will go through each player state, get our player name and player score, create a scoreboard player widget, and add that widget to the vertical box. So let's compile and save that. Make sure everything else is compiled and saved. And let's go and make sure that widget is spawned at the start of the game. So for that we need to go and find our player controller. So if you go to your world settings or your player folder and open up your player controller, let's start commenting these a bit. Remember, this is from last week. This was our begin play section. So let's just comment that and say set up widgets at start. And then this other section here, let's just comment around this and say score handling. Okay, so let me just drag down here, give us a bit of space. So last week we set up the My Score widget and added it to the viewport. What we want to do now is we also want to add the Scoreboard widget as well. So let's drag from here, create widget, and we'll create a scoreboard widget. Let's zoom in there a bit so you can see what's going on. Let's store the value of the widget so that we can call the update score event later on. So promote to variable, and we'll call the variable W scoreboard. And lastly, we'll add to the viewport. So let's just copy this one with Control W and drag the scoreboard widget into add to viewport. So this will now, at the start of the game, it will now create the My Score widget, and it will also create a scoreboard widget. So at this point in time, this scoreboard widget will be empty because remember it was an empty container. It only gets populated when we call the update score on it. So what we then want to do is call that update score event whenever a score changes for any player. So if we go to our score handling section, you remember we had this client show score event, and that was called from the onRep notify in the player state. So whenever the score updated for a player and it was replicated to the client, it then called this show score event, which got the player score and put it on the screen. In fact, let's just drag this over here so it's a bit clearer. It's the player score going into the update score event. So all we need to do is we need to update the score on the scoreboard at any time the score changes. So let's pull in W scoreboard, the reference to our scoreboard widget, with Control. And if we drag off there, we've got another update score event that we created just now that goes through all of the player states and creates the child player. And so we'll do that. And we don't need to pass the player score here because that update score event is iterating through all the player states to get the player name and score. So that should probably work. Now there will be a couple of things we need to come back and fix, but if we compile and save that, let's give it a go, excuse me, and see what happens. Let's set it up for 2 players and go into play mode. Okay. Now we don't see anything on the screen, so that's the first issue. Remember, we haven't done an update score yet, so we won't see the scoreboard until the first gate gets passed through. That's something we'll go and have to fix in a minute. But let's start off with the server and look for a gate. And let's go through the gates, get a score. And can you see so stop there, it has updated the score on the server, and it's also created the scoreboard with the 2 players and the right scores, and it's even done that on the client as well. So it's actually updated it on both client and server, which is exactly what we wanted. So let's go and go on the client, and let's go into a gate here, and you're seeing our first main problem here. It has updated the score, so now the score is 1-all, but it didn't clear the previous entries from the scoreboard. So that's luckily quite a simple fix. So let's go ahead and make that change, and then we'll test it out again. Let's go back to the Scoreboard widget, and you noticed in our update score event we went through all the player states and then added the child to vertical box, but what we didn't do is when we came into the update score the second time, we didn't clear out the children of this box before we added them again. So we just need to add in a clear child event. So get your player container, let's move this down a bit, Control, drag the player container in, and if you drag out of here and do clear children, what that will do is effectively it will remove all of those child widgets from the vertical box before we then go through the player states and add them back in again. So that should cure that problem of it just building up the scoreboard over and over again. So let's go into play, and let's just make them equal sizes, keep it up the right way. So I'm going to start off on the client this time, go through the gate, okay, and it says I've got 1 point, and the scoreboard on both client and server has updated to show the score for both players. If I go into the next gate, it doesn't add to it, it just updates the score. So that's working nicely. Let's just quickly check on the server side. If I go through here, it should score a point for the server and updates on both 2-1. So that's working brilliantly. So the final thing we need to do is we don't want to show the scoreboard only when somebody's done got the first score. So this is where it can be quite confusing. Where should I call the scoreboard update at the beginning of the game? Well, what you need to think about is you don't want to call the score update event until the widgets have been created for the clients. And in fact, if you think about it some more, what would be really good is just have a reset score or an initialize score, and then our onRep notify can show the score when we've initialized the score for that player. So let's do that. Let's work backwards. Let's go to our player state. We haven't actually opened the player state yet this tutorial, but go to your player folder and go to player state. So here we had our onRep player score function, which called the client show score. But if you go back to the main event graph, we had an add score function. So what I want to do is add another server function that I call at the beginning of the game, which initializes the score to 0. So let's create a new custom event, and I'm going to call this server initialize score. And remember, anything to do with the score handling we are running on the server, because we want it to be run on a trusted as a trusted event. And here all we really need to do is alt drag the player score and set the player score to 0. So that will set the score to 0 and notify the onRep notify of a change. And that onRep notify, if you remember, will then call the client show score, which is what we want. So all we need to do is initialize the score as soon as we've got the widget set up for the player. So let's compile and save this, go back to our player controller, And in our startup logic, as a final thing, we want to initialize the score on this server. So let's drag this score handling down a bit and create an extra space for an initialize event. So this is on the player controller, custom event, server, initialize score. Zoom in a bit. It's going to run on the server. And we want to get the player state. So let's copy these two. That's our custom player state. And instead of adding score, this is going to be called at the beginning of the game. So we will do server initialize score, which will set it to 0. And the final thing we want to do is we want to call that after we've created our score and scoreboard widget. We want to call the initialize score. So let's just think about this logic, follow it through. It's going to start off as each player joins. It'll find out if it's the local player, create the score widgets, and then go to the server to initialize the score. This will initialize the score in the custom player state, and then the replication notify event will call the update score. We know that we have a widget now to show the scores. Now, not all the players may have joined at this point in time. So if I'm the very first person to join, it will just show my score, and the scoreboard will just show my player state. But as each player joins, this will get called again for the other players, and it will update until the last player joins, and then the scoreboard will have all of the player states. So this works really well. I mean, most cases, everybody will join so quickly you won't even notice this building up. But if you had a bit of lag, the scoreboard will build up as people join, which again is what you want. So we haven't had to put any delays or any trickery in here. It's just using, again, this rep notify to do this. So let's compile, save this, and let's give it a go. Now there is going to be a problem with this, but it's a subtle thing, and I'll explain how we fix it in a minute. So let's go into play mode again. Okay, and you probably, well, you will have noticed it has spawned the scoreboard on the server, but it hasn't spawned it on the client. And this is the subtle issue with the rep notify. Because the default value for the score was 0, and because we set it to 0, it didn't do the rep notify for the clients, because I believe the way it works is it only replicates if there's been a change in the value. And because it was 0 before and 0 after, it says, well, there's no change that I need to notify anybody about. It showed on the server because for some reason the server generates an on-rep notify by default. So I had to think about this for a short while. I thought, how do we fix this? And I came up with this solution, which is to set the default value to a score that you're never going to get, which is a negative score. So if you go back to your player state and choose your player score and set the default value for the player score to -1. So now what will happen, let's compile and save this. Now what will happen is in our player controller, when we begin playing and do the initialize score event, it will call the server initialize score event in the player state, and that will set the score to 0 with the rep notify. But now it says, oh, I have changed from -1 to 0, so I do need to know the client who owns this player state that it has changed. So this should do the job. Let's go into play mode. And that's great. We now have a scoreboard for both the server and the client, and we really ought to test it out for multiple clients as well. So let me come out and go into the play the variables and change it to 3 players. Go into play mode. And I'm going to sort this out in a later video. You see that I've got this weird collision going on because I'm not spawning the cars in random places. So let's just start up again. Okay, that's fine. And let me get the other client. Put it on one side. So now we've got 3 clients here. So you can see we've got the server on the right hand side, we've got client 1 and client 2 on the left hand side, and the scoreboard has been shown at the start of the game for all 3. And if we start with client 1 and we drive into a gate, if I don't crash into the other vehicle, you see that it has updated the scoreboard on all 3 machines. And if I go to, let's go through another gate here just to show it's working. And so score goes up to 2, and immediately the scoreboards on all 3 connected machines work. Let's go to the client and drive through a gate as well. And that's been updated. There is an issue here because I'm spawning you may have noticed the score went up to 3 on the first server. Because I'm spawning my gates in a very confined space, there's a risk of the gate spawning roughly where the other gate was, so it'll straight away trigger that gate. But when we have it over the whole desert, that probably won't be an issue. So you can see as I go through each gate, it's updating the score on the server and replicating that to all of the clients and updating the scoreboard. So it's working really well. So I hope you found this a useful tutorial. In the next tutorial, I'll look at either creating a sort of a win condition for the game, maybe first to 10. And also at some point we'll look at sounds as well, like engine sounds and sort of ambient sounds. So it'll be one of those 2 in the next tutorial. Other than that, stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.